Sali purvet k'tserengo Dem jujigari purvet k'tserengo Sof bi khabari purvet k'tserengo Ishke asari purvet k'tserengo Me puzvne jujigari पजुगा अपने ख्याल ने जो नजरी पजुगा ये ज़बान तो करत जो दर्द कसा निवीनास्त्यानो बवर्ब पजुगा सोफ भी खबारी पुरवेद कत्सरेंगो इश्क असारी पुरवेद कत्सरेंगो Sali purvet k'tserengo Dem jujigari purvet k'tserengo Thai mohabbat daji daji Taba mai jaan bilin Tu gar the hari वीरान बिलिन गोरशातें ठक बिलन पटे गोरशातें ठक बिलन पटे शातुन गमई हवा शातुन गमई हवा Johanus मैयार धैनों लिखी सजदा हिये छागारी शेने बो हिये छागारी शेने बो ए जालिम बेवफा जालिम बेवफा उठ छोर आया तेर हुस्न शजन बेकाबू से बेतबा बुट छोर आया तेर हुस्न शजन बेकाबू से बेतबार डरमन उसकी लटों डाले दोने मुश थला थला उन्हें अंगिनु कोई चिरुम सर जगचिया हजार थला थला
Good evening and Yali Madat. Welcome to another episode of Summer Reflections. While Friday Night Reflections is on hiatus, we will be revisiting some of our best programs from the past year. Tonight, we will hear from some visionary voices on the architecture of pluralism. How does architecture act as a medium of communication? In our tradition, how does architecture serve as an exploration of our relationship between faith, culture, and identity? To explore these questions, we will hear from Thomas Woltz, the architect behind the Aga Khan Garden, Alberta, and Hanif Kara. We hope you enjoy tonight's program.
Welcome and bienvenue. A warm welcome to everyone joining us this evening, coming to you live on location at the Aga Khan Garden here at the University of Alberta, Botanic Garden just outside of Edmonton. My name is Salima Ibrahim, and it's an honor to be your MC this evening. Today we have a unique opportunity for an insider's look at the garden and a chance to explore this beautiful space. The garden we are in today was a gift to the University of Alberta from His Highness the Aga Khan, celebrating over 40 years of partnership between the Aga Khan Development Network, AKDN, and the University of Alberta. At the convocation ceremony of the University of Alberta in 2009, His Highness first announced his desire to give a gift that would celebrate the university's 100th anniversary and his own Golden Jubilee, marking 50 years since he became Imam, or spiritual leader, of the Shia Ismaili Muslim community. The garden has realized his wish to create a space of educational and aesthetic value, a setting for enhancing our understanding of Islamic culture and design, and a place for public reflection and enjoyment. And so we are here today to reflect on the importance of spaces like this and how they foster intercultural understanding, pluralism, and connection. This evening's program will begin with a look back at the official inauguration of the Aga Khan Garden in 2018. This will be followed by a fascinating discussion between two renowned architects, Thomas Woltz, one of the leading landscape architects in the world, and Hanif Kara, a decorated and accomplished structural engineer and professor at the Harvard School of Design. To start our program, we revisit a very special day just 2 years ago on October 16, 2018, when His Highness the Aga Khan officially inaugurated the Aga Khan Garden, Alberta, the northernmost Islamic garden in the world, and the first garden of its kind in Western Canada, and shared with us his vision for this incredible space.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Your Honor, Lois Mitchell, the Honourable Rachel Notley, Honourable Ministers, Your Worships, Chancellor Stollery, President Turpin, distinguished guests. It is always a great pleasure to greet old friends and welcome new friends at a celebration like this. But today's inauguration stands out for me as particularly joyous. For one thing, the old friendships we renew today are especially meaningful. We look back, of course, to the welcome in Alberta of members of the Ismaili community who settled here almost half a century ago, often in very difficult circumstances. And those bonds of welcome have been continually renewed through the years, especially through our rewarding partnerships with the University of Alberta. One of the special gifts that old friends offer is introducing us to wonderful new friends, and that has also happened here. The project we celebrate today, the inauguration of the Aga Khan Garden, is a particularly happy example. I think all of you have had the pleasure in your personal life or your professional life of seeing a fascinating story develop happily from beginning to end. We recall the excitement of a new beginning, as well as that deep sense of grateful satisfaction when the planning works, when the hope is realized and the vision is achieved. Well, that is exactly how I feel today. I was fortunate to have been part of this project's conception, and I feel fortunate to be here today to help mark its realization. I remember well my visits to the University of Alberta during my Golden Jubilee year in 2008, and again for the graduation ceremonies in 2009. That was when we first discussed this dream of creating here, together, a new Islamic garden. I paid my first visit to the proposed garden site at that time, wondering even then just how this dream might come true in practice. It seemed like an unlikely dream to many. After all, the great traditions of Islamic gardens has its roots in very different times and places. The symbol of the garden as a spiritual symbol goes back to the Holy Quran itself, where the garden ideal is mentioned many times. Down through many centuries, Islamic culture has continued to see the garden as a very special place, where the human meets further proof of the divine. The development of the garden as a symbol of Islamic ideals flourished most magnificently some 500 to 600 years ago, and that happened, of course, in the warmer climates of Southern Asia. And yet, there we were in Edmonton, a decade ago, proposing to extend that lovely Eastern and Southern tradition at the start of the 21st century to the unique natural environment, somewhat cold, of northern and western Canada. This proposed new garden, to be precise, would be the northernmost Islamic garden ever created. Over the past 9 years, I have been able to watch the dream come true as we agreed on the configuration of the site, assembled a steering committee, chose an architectural firm, and reviewed development plans. And then, with the planning completed, the building process took just some 18 months, finishing on time and on budget, as planners like to point out. Me too. As I look out at this garden today, what I think about, above all, are the people who made it possible, their dedication, their talent, and their remarkable energy. I want them all to know that in celebrating this new garden today, we're also celebrating them. Theirs is a highly valued gift to the generations to come, who also must be privileged by experiencing the spirituality and harmony of multiple life forms. They include construction workers and gardeners, planners and administrators, artists and scholars, architects and designers, including the landscape design firm of Nelson Bird Woltz. They include dedicated members of the Ismaili and other Muslim communities in Alberta and other parts of Canada, the remarkable family of the University of Alberta, government officials at all levels, and those who serve the Aga Khan Trust for Culture and the Aga Khan Development Network. At the heart of their efforts, of course, was the inspiring power of the Islamic garden itself. For a central part of the garden tradition is the high calling of human stewardship, our responsibility to honor, to protect, and to share the gifts of the natural world. Gardens in this context can be seen not as imitations of nature, but as humanity's interpretations of nature, their geometric structures providing a human framework in which we can experience, in this case, the magnificent fluctuations of the Albertan landscape. The garden of Islamic tradition is also a place where the flow of refreshing water reminds us of divine blessing. It is a place for meditation and quiet renewal. But I would likewise emphasize that the garden through history has also been seen as a social space, a place for learning, for sharing, for romance, for diplomacy, for reflection on the destiny of the human race. And even as we share the garden experience with others, we can feel a connection with those who walked through similar gardens in the past. I would also mention one additional aspect of the particular garden we inaugurate today. It symbolizes not only the creative blending of the natural and the human, but also the beauty of multiple intercultural cooperation. One of the great questions facing humanity today is how we can honor what is distinctive about our separate identities, and at the same time, welcome a diversity of identities as positive elements in our lives. This city and this country have been among the world leaders in providing positive answers to that ancient question. The project we inaugurate today is a beautiful extension of that Canadian tradition. In Canada and in many other places, the Aga Khan Trust for Culture has made a major commitment to creating and renewing important green spaces in recent years. We can look back on 10 recent successes in places ranging from Cairo to Zanzibar, from Toronto to Kabul, from Dushanbe in Tajikistan to Bamako in Mali. In 2018 alone, I helped to inaugurate 3 such garden projects in London, in Delhi, and now here in Alberta. But the story does not end here. In fact, the story of Canadian Islamic Gardens itself is not yet completed. Our plans are now advancing, in fact, for a new park to be developed a few hundred miles southwest of here in Burnaby, British Columbia. Yes, to be sure, it will surpass Edmonton as the westernmost Islamic garden. But of course we can be assured that Edmonton's garden will still have a lasting claim as the northernmost. I've talked about the past today, but I would close by emphasizing the future. It is wonderful, at a moment like this, to think of all those who will visit here in the years to come. Our work now is to sustain this space, to create new experiences, and to meet new challenges. As you walk through these gardens, you will see evidence of the ways in which future generations will be able to make the most of this site. It is our hope and expectation on this special day that the Aga Khan Garden here at the University of Alberta will truly be a gift that keeps on giving. Thank you.
We now have the privilege of hearing from the man who took the vision of this garden and brought it to life, Thomas Woltz. Thomas is the owner of Nelson Bird Woltz Landscape Architects. He was named the Design Innovator of the Year by the Wall Street Journal magazine in 2013. In 2011, he was invested into the American Society of Landscape Architects Council of Fellows, one of the highest honors in his profession. During the past 20 years of practice, Thomas has crafted a body of work that integrates beauty, function, and form. His exquisite craftsmanship and sensitivity to complex biological systems has yielded thousands of acres of reforested land, reconstructed wetlands, native meadows, and flourishing wildlife habitat. His design work infuses places where people live, work, and play with narratives of the land that inspire stewardship. Many of these projects focus on restoration of damaged ecological infrastructure within working farmland and create models of biodiversity and sustainable agriculture. One of the most sought-after landscape architects on the continent, his current projects include Hudson Yards in New York City, Memorial Park in Houston, the Ismaili Center Houston, and Cornwall Park in Auckland, New Zealand. Joining Thomas is Professor Hanif Kara. Professor Kara is a practicing structural engineer and professor in practice of architectural technology at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. He is recognized for linking design, research, education, and practice. As design director and co-founder of AKT2, his particular design-led approach and interest in innovative form, pushing material uses, sustainable construction, and complex analysis methods have allowed him to work on numerous pioneering projects at the forefront of many challenges facing the built environment. Hanif's career extends into wider areas of design beyond the structural engineering disciplines. He is the first engineer to be appointed on the steering committee for the highly regarded International Aga Khan Award for Architecture, where he continues today and was on the award's master jury for the 2004 cycle. He is a fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects, Institute of Civil Engineers, Royal Academy of Engineering, Institute of Structural Engineering, the Royal Society of Arts, and sits on the board of trustees of the Architecture Foundation. It's a real pleasure to have these remarkable individuals joining us today. Hanif, over to you.
So thank you to the team in Canada for inviting me and the AKTC for asking me to represent you. I'm here with Thomas Woltz, talking about the gardens in Alberta. Thomas, first question, very personal. Can you recall when you were first ever thought of being a landscape architect, and why?
I can recall. I had completed my studies as an undergraduate in architecture at the University of Virginia, but it also added the fine arts and architectural history. So after those 3 degrees, I went to work in Europe, and I lived in Venice. And Venice as a city, without a lot of the landscapes that I thought were landscapes, such as meadows, forests, fields, gardens, but rather a mineral city of water in the streets and stone paving and plazas, I realized I was having an incredible landscape experience every day, but it wasn't the language of landscape that I had always assumed growing up on a farm in the United States. And it was somehow in that 5 years that I started to understand that everything outside the building is something that can be designed, and they are landscapes. And so that led me to an interest in landscape architecture. And when I came back to the United States to complete my graduate studies, I first did a degree in architecture and then a second degree in landscape architecture, went to work for one of my professors and have been doing that for the last 22 years. So that was my journey to it, but it was understanding the landscape as something more abstract than gardens.
So the journey from a farm to understanding landscapes appears quite a distance from the Aga Khan Garden. Was that your first work on Islamic gardens? And can you share with us how you were selected for that project and what your first contact with His Highness and his team was like?
The Aga Khan Trust for Culture reached out to our office, I believe in 2009, and we were invited to submit credentials for their review. And after a few months, we heard back from them that we were invited to interview directly with His Highness. this was absolutely our first Islamicate landscape, but it was definitely not my first introduction to the power and history of Islamic gardens. I'd studied under Reuben Rainey, who's a fantastic scholar in the history of landscape architecture, and had always been drawn to and fascinated by the use of geometry, water, fragrance, sound, the key principles of the Islamic landscape had actually had a very formative impact on much of our work. But it was like so many people who have not done the deep research, it remained in the realm of perhaps mimicry, in the sense of copying something, or, oh, a rill would be nice here, or a fountain, or, fragrant plants. So it did not have the depth of the journey that we were about to embark on when we were selected for this project, because in that first meeting with His Highness, I presented the work we had done, and I hope he saw within that work the potential to achieve his vision, even though we had never done anything quite like what he was asking us to do. And I'll be forever grateful for that trust that he had in our firm, Nelson Bird Woltz Landscape Architects, to deliver a meaningful response to this brief or this commission.
So it would sound like that potential obviously gave the right impression. I wonder though if during that first meeting you were already aware of where the site was, and how was Alberta selected as the site, and why in particular this site. That plus, from what it sounds like, nobody asked you the question at that point, so I will. What exactly is an Islamic garden?
Okay, those were two giant questions, and I'll take the first one first, and then come back to the Islamic garden question. We were told that the site would be in Edmonton, Alberta, and that the selected site was part of what was then called the Devonian Botanic Garden, and now is called the University of Alberta Botanic Garden, and that it would be part of the collection of gardens that the University of Alberta Botanic Garden manages. So we knew that it was very cold, that the climate was unlike many climates familiar to the Islamic diaspora of gardens, and that would be a great challenge. I was excited that it was part of a botanic garden because the horticultural knowledge, the care, the maintenance, the commitment to a garden open to the public realm would all be in place, presumably. So that was very exciting. As a firm that designs mostly public parks, public gardens, and botanic gardens, this was quite exciting to us. I'll get to it later, but the other part of work that our firm does is very large-scale sustainable agricultural operations. And that's just a hint of what I'll talk about later when we dive into the garden. So yes, we did know about the site. I believe His Highness's choice of Edmonton came from the community. I think it was a suggestion coming out of the Canadian Ismaili community that there had been a long history of graduates from the University of Alberta coming to work, particularly in the medical fields, I believe, in different clinics and hospitals that His Highness had created around the world. And so there was a long-standing relationship with the University of Alberta. And you have centers in Ottawa, Toronto, Vancouver, and so Edmonton was another of the Canadian departments that could have an important gift. So I think that's where it came from as an idea. And the infrastructure of the Botanic Garden and the university made a tremendous amount of sense for the care of the garden long term. Now, for the bigger question of what did our research reveal as an Islamic garden, that is a giant topic that many great scholars way beyond my skill set have entertained for generations. And I was very fortunate that His Highness put us in contact with D. Fairchild Ruggles, D.D. Ruggles, and Jim Westcott, to name two important scholars in the history of the Islamic landscape. So as my team at Nelson Bird Woltz and I were traveling, reading, absorbing information about the history of the Islamic gardens around the world, we could call them, we had access to them to say, are we on the right track? Does this make sense? Or is this something new that hasn't really been discussed? But more, it was them serving as scholarly mentors to us. So they had a very important role in shaping our understanding. I sound like I'm avoiding the answer probably of what is an Islamic garden.
No, I was going to ask you, is that common to be given access to authorities? You can go on and answer it, but I just wondered if that was common in your work, where you have access to these sorts of people.
In our practice, I would call it a research-based design process within Nelson Bird Woltz, and that really applies to all of our projects. So zooming out for a second and just talking about the mission of our firm, our mission and our process are really fused. We engage in deep research into the ecological history of a site. And in fact, that might be 50 million years ago. When was the site formed geologically? How was it formed? And in that understanding, you will find inspiration for a contemporary landscape design. Parallel to that ecological research, we are doing cultural research. So in this case, it was traveling to India and Egypt and reading and going to MIT and Harvard and different libraries, meeting with these scholars. So when your process is understanding the ecology and the culture of a place to build a public landscape, that becomes a very authentic source of design ideas. So in a way, it removes you as the author firm. In some ways, you are a vehicle for creating something new, but based on the very authentic clues that you find within the landscape. So this fit very well into our process. Typically, we have to go find those scholars and ask them to advise us or become part of our team. And in this case, it was His Highness's idea to really offer them in service to our process, and it made a tremendous difference.
So it sounds as though at that point, and through your traveling, you probably have or could articulate what you think the larger mission of the Aga Khan Garden was, and how that manifests into what you built, which might also give you the opportunity to try to unfold what the garden was, or what an Islamic garden is in its essence. Let's say the simple 3 or 4 points about what makes an Islamic garden.
Well, I think there are characteristics that many Islamic landscapes have in common. And those are things people are probably quite familiar with. A sense of form and order through geometry is probably the most recognizable and well-known idea of the Islamic garden or the Islamic landscape. And I'm actually going to make a little bit of a difference. So let's talk about the Islamic garden for now. So geometry, the famous Chaharbagh, 4 gardens. Geometry, as in discussions with His Highness, that I really loved these conversations of understanding that within the Islamic world, within the Muslim world, order and geometry found in nature is proof of the existence of God, the order of the universe. The hand of God is in the structure, the geometric form and structure that we find in nature. So within a flower, within just the form of the landscape, the geometric representation of that is the divine. And that geometry present in all living things is proof of the order of the universe. And I just personally really resonated with that idea. Maybe it's also as being trained as an architect and a landscape architect and loving that sense of order in the landscape within a frame of the chaos of context. I always found that very beautiful and very reassuring. And also, having grown up in the United States with European descent parents, the Western idea of nature is always naturalistic and romantic and curving paths. And, there's a kind of, maybe it comes mostly through Great Britain, but this legacy of the English landscape as the world as a sort of idealized garden, but it's very romantic and sort of picturesque. Instead, the Islamic landscape is one of order as the proof of God in nature. And I just found that so reassuring and fascinating.
As I understand that, if I understand it correctly, Thomas, sorry to interrupt you there, the geometric framework is the tool that you've used the most, because that comes from the history of Islamic gardens and from the wider brief I understand that you were given. It also comes with a certain rigor. So how would you describe the different parts of the garden being connected? Because that kind of rigor can actually create a separation between the parts so that the whole is not coherent.
Correct. I would say the thread that binds the garden is probably the second most well-known aspect of the Islamic landscape, and that is water. And the challenge and exciting part of this garden is that it is an Islamic landscape, a new idea of an Islamic landscape for the 21st century, located in an extreme northern climate that is very, very cold, and on a site with a lot of specificity. So the challenge was, how do we bring this knowledge and this idea of the Islamic landscape and make it also feel Canadian? And so that came through water in many different forms, the ecology of the site, and through horticulture. So that was a way that we threaded this into Canada and made anyone coming to visit the garden know at once that they are in an Islamic landscape, but they are also in an essentially Canadian landscape.
That's very interesting. It's interesting you bring up water as the sacred and the purity of Islamic gardens, but it's also worth just talking about, where that originates from, the Epic of Gilgamesh and the whole history of water. But what the sacredness is so important. What I would ask is, how does it sort of cope with what His Highness has described as the northernmost Islamic garden? Because with that description comes the thought that it will freeze and all those other things that happen to it. So just give you a chance to say, if that was such an important part, and Islam was born in the desert, so we know the relevance of water in that sense. Maybe you can explain to us how you've used the water specifically.
Well, this touches on the journey I took to India. His Highness suggested that I travel to see a long list of different Mughal landscapes, and then also to Egypt to see Al-Azhar Park and the Fatimid city and the walls and the work that the Trust for Culture had done there. So it was quite informative, and all the while I'm trying to understand the scale of the detail, the scale of a Chaharbagh and the different range of that, because I think that's what's missing in many interpretations of Islamic landscapes, is a lack of understanding of material and scale. It's something someone's seen in photographs is very different. His Highness said you need to stand in these landscapes and feel the heat in India. You need to smell the fragrance of jasmine. You have to, in a way, measure these landscapes with your own body. And I appreciate that very much. As a landscape architect, we have to experience the world with all of our senses. And the Islamic garden elevates you by touching all of those senses of sound, sight, smell, and taste. So it was on that trip that I was just digging, trying to understand, what was this garden going to be about? How was it not going to be a copy of or quotations of existing gardens. The worst would be if it were a pastiche of famous gardens. But it needs to answer this brief of the 21st century. And I thought about, what are the different challenges of our century? And, right now there are many. But one of them is agriculture and the health and sanctity and safety of food and the quality of water. Those two things are intimately connected. And it was standing at Ram Bagh, a spectacular garden that when I was there was almost in ruin. All the flowers were gone, all the plantings were gone. It's a garden that had not been transformed by the English, by a chaharbagh being filled with soil and bringing the plants up to level, but it still had elevated walkways because the four tanks of a chaharbagh were often lower. Shrubs and plants planted there sheared across the top, and they would flower on the top like carpets. But you could divert water into them, and they would build a kind of microclimate in the heat, and you could preserve the water, use a little bit to cultivate the plants. So being at Ram Bagh with none of the flowers or plants there, but only the architecture of the garden, I realized that the inherent language of geometry in the Islamic garden is born from agriculture in arid climates. So the cistern, the tank, the font, the source, then carefully managed water in a small, narrow stone channel to convey it to the plants that need irrigation in order to create food so that people could survive in dry climates. And that link to agriculture and to the productive landscape as the very roots of the form of an Islamic garden was mind-blowing to me and very fascinating. And it took seeing one stripped down to its very bones in order to build back ideas about agriculture. Now, this was very exciting because working with the University of Alberta, the department that manages the University of Alberta Botanic Garden is the Department of Life Sciences and the Environment. So they are keenly interested in agriculture and productive landscapes. So the idea of could this garden address, through the idea of cultivation, something within Canada that was an issue. And we discovered that there are very few sources of native wetland plants available in Canada for the restoration of post-extraction landscapes. So we thought, we can take an Islamic garden, make it a productive garden, not just a pleasure garden or ornamental garden, as they've been interpreted so many times, but rather a beautiful geometry, a garden. We could make a beautiful garden structured by geometry with this thread of water used carefully to irrigate the plants. They could be cultivated and the seeds given out. And in a way, it became a parallel of the positive radiating influence of Islam as these seeds cultivated at the Aga Khan Garden go out across Canada to restore these fragile ecosystems and ecologies. So for us, that became really the story of this garden and its power. It's only possible because of the partnership with the University of Alberta. They care for and host the garden and cultivate these wetland plants. So when you have a garden about the calibration of water and you're cultivating wetland plants, it's a happy marriage of mission and beauty.
You're very poetic about the receiving of sensory experience in the way you describe it all. So with the added poignancy currently about health and the pandemic, is there some things that, that poignancy is making us all want to go to greenness and gardens for restoring the inner garden of the human being, but also for general restoration? So do you think that there are some lessons that you might want to expand on in relation to that current problem that we're having with health? Did you put any particular species or smells apart from the noise from the water and so on?
Well, the garden was designed maybe 6 years ago and then under construction and has been open to the public now for a couple of years. So I think the answer to that question is, not knowing a pandemic was in our future. It's more that lessons learned in that garden have conveyed to influence the way we're treating current landscape projects. And I think if you want a garden to truly heal, then it needs to, as I mentioned earlier, touch all of the senses. And so I think after the Aga Khan Garden project, our whole firm is probably more constantly aware of fragrance, color, sound, quiet, just working with His Highness on things like seating and seating in benches that allow you to have community and talk. And so those are outdoors, they're at a safe distance from one another, but you still can see each other. And so the things that we discussed in this garden have almost been, or they have been influential on how we address landscapes now, to make sure that we are bringing forward the power of a garden to be healing, meditative, and in a way, a sacred experience.
So let's go on to the site problems. I know it's on a dune ecology, and you refer to the platform and the plinth. Were there some lessons from the issues you uncovered on site? Was there something specific that you might want to share with the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you imagine a large-scale geometric form finding its way into an existing garden, it's quite a challenge. And His Highness had made a site visit with the president of the University of Alberta and the provost and the director of the garden, and had made some observations in looking at different sites, different potential sites throughout the existing botanic garden. And they wandered through a dell that was a series of bowl-shaped terrain. And this is part of this perched high dune ecology that is typical in Alberta. So the trees grow very slowly. The soils are very shallow, and they're deep sands beneath what topsoil you have. So His Highness recognized the shape of this wetland bowl, and it did have perched water and wetlands in the floor of this area. And then there was a moment where there was a high ridge, and he suggested that would be the point for prospect over the garden, and it looked down over an existing pond. So in a way, he envisioned the procession through the garden that we picked up and brought form to. So, I'm the one speaking to you today, but as you know, we have a large team at Nelson Bird Woltz on this project, and working very closely with me on the design lead was Breck Gastinger, and Nathan Foley was also particularly instrumental in the construction supervision of the whole project. So, as a team, we take these instructions from His Highness and we start fitting them to the site. So the result is a very quiet and intimate arrival into the wetland. So the sign to the Aga Khan Garden is a very modest wall with the symbol of His Highness, and it just says Aga Khan Garden. And you walk through this wall and you're on a narrow boardwalk that takes you across the wetland. So you're very aware, you're immersed in an authentic Canadian experience, and you come to a rotated rectangular garden that we call the Woodland Bog, or the Woodland Garden. And there is a large elliptical stone table that has a shallow surface on the top that holds water. So it reflects the sky. And all through this walk, as you're approaching the garden, our hope is your heart rate is going down. You see the native plants of Canada. The boardwalk we were able to insert with doing very little tree removal for the garden. At the end of the boardwalk, there's a tiny trickle of water, the source fountain. It's very modest. It's very humble. It reminds you of a spring. So if your first water was the wetland, the ecological water, the second is reminding you of a spring, the source of life. As you turn from that, You get to the Chowk, which is an open plaza, and there are pencil jets of water that light makes a geometric tracery when it hits these pencil lines of water. That beckons you to rise up the ramps or steps onto the Talar terrace, which overlooks the Chahar Bagh. So the Talar are two open-air pavilion-like structures with a taut tensile roof to shelter people from sun and rain and snow. And it provides shaded prospect out over the garden. So this is a place to linger and take in the whole garden. It's also the mediation between the woodland walk and the formal garden. At the center of this terrace is the source fountain, where the water surges up out of a geometric cube that again evokes this idea of the continuity of the presence of unity within the garden, because the geometries are everywhere, in the pavement, in the fountains. And then the water cascades down over Chini Khana, which was something we were inspired by the Chini Khan of Mughal gardens, which is a wall of niches. I think the direct translation is china cabinet. So in a garden, these niches would be filled with oil lamps, and water falls in front of it. So you can imagine in the 1300s, that would have been like fireworks. I mean, it would have been a dazzling display of water shimmering in front of this wall of lamps and candles. Then the water proceeds on a very large tank and goes to the Mutabi, or the floating island, and that then cascades into the Kala Pond. So this is the sequence of water and experience through the garden, from the wetland all the way to the pond. I want to add something I was mentioning earlier. So the Chahar Bagh, the Talar, the Chabutra gardens, these small gardens of geometry based on the 5-petal rose and the 6-sided ice crystal, all of this is the formality one might expect in an Islamic garden. I want to make that distinction because thanks to the research of D.D. Ruggles, we were made clearly aware of the Islamic landscape beyond the garden, and that is the idea of the bustan. So many of the historic walled gardens would have had a bustan, or orchard, or grassland. It was the landscape of cultivation. So back to our ideas about agriculture being one of the crises that we need to solve today, this idea of the ancient Islamic cultivated landscape adjacent to water of fruit and grasses and grains inspired us to make a long meadow all the way around the Kala Pond. And I think there are 30 different varieties of fruit trees that are grown. And here again, the partnership with the University of Alberta was phenomenal because they had done test trials on what fruit would be productive in that climate. So that brings an Islamic landscape to the Islamic garden, and the Islamic garden to the Canadian wetland and forest ecology.
Wow. So you, I think you've described with wonder the tapestry of the supreme features that probably will lead people not only to stay there for a long time, but walk through as well. And that physical picture that you're painting is already enticing, but maybe we should talk a little bit about the impact now, which is the people who haven't seen it, what has happened beyond the garden, beyond the university, beyond Alberta. Has it had a significant impact that you're aware of so far? And connected to that, I suppose, is, how does it serve the bigger questions that particularly Canada and the Canadian Ismaili community relate to very well, which is the platform for dialogue and concepts of pluralism. So I'm just wondering whether it's already leading to some of those kind of conversations for Canadians.
Yeah. Well, I feel that the entire garden is rooted in this idea of pluralism. And His Highness was very clear about this being a landscape that would welcome all people. Anyone in the world should be able to come here and learn something about the ancient culture of the Muslim world as it relates to landscape and gardens. And so as a place for people to come to gain enlightenment about the extraordinary cultural and artistic and horticultural contributions of Islam to the world, it is a powerful step forward in understanding one another as human beings, understanding one another's hearts. And my hope is that this garden will touch people, will educate people, and inform them about the power of this very ancient, magnificent history of the Islamic landscape. So as a site for conversation, as a site for education, as a place for learning about things that many people in North America are unaware of and not well educated. And my hope is that this is an important step forward for us to come to know each other accurately and know each other's hearts. And in that way, we come to love each other. And I think the landscape, because it touches us in ways that we often can't really describe, I think the landscape is a perfect place for the dialogue of acceptance and pluralism to begin.
Fabulous, Thomas, really wonderful. I think maybe we should go back and try and round it off to your kind of final comments that you might have. I certainly am aware that you're working with the community and the AKTC on a number of other projects, including you have worked on King's Cross, Burnaby, Houston, now Houston together we're working on. I wonder if you could say something about what it's like to work with His Highness, the community, and generally the Aga Khan Trust for Culture in your closing remarks, Thomas. And if you have any questions for me as well.
Well, thank you for that question. It has been a tremendous honor to work with His Highness and in service to the greater Ismaili community in so many different places. I have been so moved by his ability to see right through complex concepts and know exactly the few words of direction to get us on track to achieve his vision for these different landscapes. And that has been a great educational experience for me. One of the things that is unique to His Highness is so often when we work for clients, we explain to them that we have a long and complex research process, that we have to deeply understand a culture that is not our own. And in this case, it was part of the brief, was to do extensive research and to learn all we could about the Islamic diaspora. So we looked at southern Spain, North Africa, East Africa, the Far East, India, Pakistan, Iran, Iraq. So we're looking across the Muslim world at landscapes and trying to understand the fine nuances between each of these different cultural traditions across the Islamic diaspora. And so for me, it was a phenomenal scholarly journey as a maker, as a designer. As I said earlier, I am not a scholar. I've learned a lot, but I wouldn't put myself forward as a scholar, but rather a learner who builds things. And that's what's been exciting about King's Cross, looking at the Maghreb and southern Spain and the influence of the Alhambra and the Muslim influence in Spanish culture, and then taking inspiration from that and making a very abstract garden at the King's Cross project on the roof. Then now working in Houston and taking inspiration from the Persian or Iranian diaspora and the tradition of those Islamic gardens, and bringing that into a 21st century interpretation. And then, of course, the Aga Khan Garden in Edmonton was really influenced by the Mughal history of Muslim landscapes. So it's been a tremendous honor to be trained and educated, mentored by His Highness, and then given the opportunity to take that knowledge and apply it in different places and different cultures that respond to this idea of pluralistic education, of the magnificent traditions of the Islamic landscape worldwide.
Thank you, Thomas and Hanif, for that fascinating exploration of how architecture helps shape our vision for society. It's no wonder that the site upon which we stand today was almost 10 years in development, and that such extraordinary care, attention, and discipline was exercised in its planning and construction. One of my favorite quotes of His Highness the Aga Khan is that the garden is a very special place where the human meets further proof of the divine. As I listen to our guests and I look about me today, I can feel that sense reverberate throughout this magnificent setting. It fills me with a sense of awe and pride, as I know it has many before me and will continue to do so for hundreds of thousands of others in the decades to come. I hope this episode has helped to illuminate your journey and understanding of the critical role that architecture and the built environment play in shaping our lives. Good evening.